When I tested it, it was about a third of a stop fast. But I've adjusted that speed now and it's bang on, or as close to bang on as it's likely to be. The main thing is it's consistent. If it's consistent from one exposure to the next, that's the important thing, so that when you know how your camera behaves and how your exposure, how you use to set your exposure according to what your meter says, that you'll get a consistent result, that you'll get no undue surprises. That's the important thing. Anyway, that's all very good now. So I'm going to put my shutter in the outer case, which I have here. And of course we need the pieces, that the curved rack that couples to the camera, and the little pusher piece that the curved rack pushes against, and the pusher piece in turn pushes against this and cocks it. Okay, so these pieces, now these were sticky with old oil. I'm going to give them a very light wipe with molybdenum paste, and you can see all I've left there really is a faint dirty mark, because that's all that's required with molybdenum. You don't need much at all. So I've put those in place. Now the piece with the teeth goes here where the hole is in the case, and then you've got the longer section here. And now I need to get this shutter in position. And this tab has to go behind that tab there, otherwise nothing will fit. And if you're lucky, it all goes smoothly like that. Now, things to watch here. We have our flash contact at the back here, and that sort of pulls into the slot as you rotate the case, and it's dropped in there nicely. And there are 3 screws that hold the back of the case on, the outer case. This one goes in the middle. Its job, apart from holding the shutter into the outer case, is to locate the shutter on the front of the camera so that the shutter can't turn. Now we've got 2 little screws, and they both look very much the same. One is a smaller diameter than the other, and the one that's a smaller diameter than the other goes in this position. If you put the bigger one in there, not only will it not want to go in there, you'll end up damaging something. If you put the small one here where the big one's supposed to be, it'll go in, but it won't do up tight, and you're likely to strip some threads. Anyway, that's all done. Our flash contact here, there's a tiny screw at the top. We just need to do that up very lightly. That's just to ensure that the flash contact here is made. And you just need to take up the slack really. You don't need to keep winding that in. If you keep winding that in, you're only going up against plastic. You'd probably end up making a mess of something and potentially shorting things out. So that's the back of our shutter, or the main body, done. And I can close up the front with the control rings and so forth. So, what have we got here? I'll gather these pieces together. This piece and this piece. This is the piece that couples the aperture setting lever here to our front rings. It's another piece that doesn't really require much in the way of lubrication, and normally I just give this a wipe with some molybdenum paste. And if it looks like I'm sort of wiping a clean stick on this, I pretty much am. You don't really need anything that shows. This drops into the case there, and this piece runs round in that groove. So getting this on the shutter, we've got to line 3 different things really. 2 of them of course are this tab here, this groove here couples to our speed settings cam plate at that point. This cutout is to clear over this spring. This spring, that little spring gives us our detent. The little finger that comes out of the base of this thing has to couple into the slot in this piece. So that's the first thing to get in place really, is to get that thing in place. Then rotate the other thing. Oh. Right, so now our shutter speed settings cam plate, as you can see, is changing. Our speed ring is changing our shutter speed settings cam plate, and you can see it's also coupled to the diaphragm lever here. I can take off this retaining ring from the front. This piece goes on. This is the repeater, if you like, that gives us our aperture settings at the top of the shutter. At the back of it is a tiny notch, and that notch lines up with this little tab here. And this piece is the lens mount for the front. This is the piece that the front lens actually bayonets into. And these little notches here are what gives us our detents. This only goes on in one position. There's a larger diameter hole in it here. Fits over this locating pin here. And this aperture thing's just popped out of the way. Get that seated again. No, I was telling you lies, that excuse me, that wasn't the piece that goes over that pin at all. It's this little hole here in the back plate. Ah! Which is where, about there. Alright. Drop that into place and it's entered into the correct position easily. Here's our retaining ring. Start this with your fingers, and because it's a large diameter and a fine thread, it doesn't always start easily. Try not to get it cross-threaded, and here you can see I'm tightening that up using a wooden toothpick. If you use the tip of a screwdriver you will slip and you will scratch it. Now, doing this thing up, you should have positive click stops, but they should not, it should not be overly stiff. That still feels too stiff to me. So I'm backing this ring off. You can see I'm exposing a hole in the plate here all the time. So we're not turning it far. We just want a we just went past the hole there. Let's try that one. That's pretty good. Might still be a bit enthusiastic. Okay, that'll do us, I think. So you can see I've got the hole there lined up with one of the notches in the plate, and we have our tiny little screw that is so often missing, and in this case was not missing, but it was screwed back into the retaining plate, into the front plate, even though the retainer was screwed, then put in on top of it, which wasn't going to work. So get this screw started. It's a very shallow screw. It's only about, I don't know, probably one turn of thread, so it's very easy to you have trouble getting that one in place. Alright, so that's all good. I'm just looking at the marks on that ring. There's certainly marks around it and a scratch here. I'm not sure that they ever served any useful purpose to anyone. But there's our shutter, all back in its case and all ready to go. So I just need to clean up the lenses. I think they're pretty good. And we'll see about putting this back in the case. I've already cleaned the front of this lens, and of course it doesn't need to be off the camera for me to do that. And when you are working with lenses like this, it's almost pointless to clean the front surface of the lens that you're working on while you're trying to get everything back on the camera, because it's so easy to put another fingerprint on there while you're working. So here I'm just wiping the outside of this, the frame of it if you like, with some naphtha, and you see I'm pulling off all sorts of dirt and grease. Now I'm going to clean the back of that front element with some domestic glass cleaner on a cotton bud or Q-tip. I'm looking at it to see if it's picked anything up. If it's picked up anything that looked even vaguely like dirt, I'd probably start all over again. Because if there's any accumulated dirt on the lens, you've got to get it off very gently, because otherwise it'll act as an abrasive, and while you're trying to clean the lens you'll be busy cleaning the lens away. Alright, that looks pretty good to me. Make sure I haven't got a speck of dust on there, and fit this back to the camera. Now when you put this in the camera, that red dot must line up with the red dot here, and then you rotate this clockwise and it just latches into place. Now this is a bit loose. That's interesting. That suggests that it's been the bayonet has been stretched. Let's have a look at that. How do we tighten this up? Well, the first thing we need to do is check to make sure that these 3 screws are not loose. And they're not. And these tabs here are what bayonets into the front mount. And 2 of them I can see are a bit loose. So what I'm going to do is remove this, because you can't really bend them back while it's on the lens. That one's very tight. So was that one. They're only very small screws. You've got to be careful not to allow the screwdriver to slip and mar the surface of them. Okay, so I've got this off, and what I'm going to do is these 3 tabs, I'm just going to bend them up slightly so they've effectively got more tension, if you like. Okay. This pair of pliers will do nicely, because we're not moving things far, or not attempting to move things far. Let's pop this back in place. Now there's grease on the back of this face here. So this has been a well lubricated camera. Get that tab seated correctly, that's good. So in an ideal world, that when you bayonet the lens onto the front of the camera, it should be firm, it shouldn't have any rattles. It doesn't need to be ridiculously tight. Am I still in the picture? Yeah, just. So at the back, our rear lens group, I'm just going to clean that again with some domestic glass cleaner. Oh, first I'm going to clean the outside of it. A little bit of naphtha. Given the amount of grease and filth on this lens, I don't really want to get that on the lens glass itself, but I probably did. Now, as you're using something like this, rotate it so that you're continually presenting a fresh surface to the glass, and that has a tendency to limit the likelihood of you picking up some tiny fragment of dust and grinding it into the glass. That looks good. So I clean the inside surface first, put it on the camera, or put it on the shutter. That way you haven't got it open to the atmosphere to pick up any more dirt, or even stray fingerprints. And then clean the rear surface. You may have to do this more than once if there's any trace of oil on that glass, because otherwise you'll get those neat little rainbow patterns that are so frustrating to see the back of. Okay, that's looking pretty good. There are two shims here, the paper one and the metal one. I'm just going to clean these with some naphtha, and then we'll put them on the back of the shutter. Now, if I've got a mix of paper and metal, I normally put the paper one on first and then the metal one. And then I'm less likely to damage the paper one when I'm getting the shutter back on the camera body, which is our next task. Okay, so getting this back on the camera, first I'm just going to move this curved rack up slightly. That's just sitting in the neutral position, the shutter's not cocked. Put this in the body. Now that screw I mentioned on the back of this casing here couples up to this fork here. So pop that on the camera, and I'll now move the film advance carefully, and it hasn't cocked the shutter. So what I'll normally do is rack the focus right out to the closest end of the focus position, and you can see your curved rack then. I'll lift the shutter out, move it one notch further forward, drop it back in, and I moved it more than one notch then, and we'll see what happens. I'll press the film release button, move the film advance, shutter didn't cock. So I'll do the same thing again, lift my shutter out, move that rack one more tooth, press my film release button, move the film advance, shutter didn't cock. Do it again. Now if you go too far, the film advance lever won't want to complete its stroke, in which case remove the shutter. Do not force the film advance lever, otherwise you'll wreck the rack. Oh, I heard the shutter cock that time. Okay, so our shutter's in there, it's working, it's cocking correctly. I can open the back of the camera. I'm holding the shutter in position with my fingers. Take the retaining ring, make sure it's notched sides up, otherwise you won't be able to do anything with it. I'll just get that started with a toothpick. That's better. I've got my tool, carefully putting that in so I'm not bashing it into the back of the glass lens. Just rotate that. I'm just doing that up finger tight to start off with. And check my action again. That's all good. Let's set a nice slow speed. That's all working very well. It's cocking correctly. The focus moves smoothly. If you put the shutter back in there, you do it up tight and suddenly the focus is quite stiff to move. Typically it means that the shutter's not quite centered in the mount. And if you slacken it off and you can usually see where it's too tight. You can usually see that there's a lack of clearance on one side or the other. Just give it a slight nudge and tighten it back up, and you'll probably find that your problem's gone away. Alright, that's looking good. I'm going to tighten this up completely now at the back. If I can find the screwdriver I put through there. Now you'd be forgiven for thinking we're done, but we're not really, because if you listen closely, as I press the shutter release button very slowly, you'll hear a click before the shutter fires. Try that again. My video camera ran out of space on the card. Fancy that. So pressing the shutter release very slowly. Hear that click? That will have released the film advance to allow you to wind on again. And that happened before the shutter fired. It's supposed to happen pretty much at the same instant the shutter fires. That tells me that I need to make an adjustment on the top of the release lever. Basically, the adjustment I need to make is to turn the screw on the top of the release lever down perhaps a half a turn. So we need to take the top off the camera and have a look. So I'll remove my rewind. If you've got that, if the adjustment is out, as it is here, you would lose an exposure, potentially, if you were, say, following some action, things moved into a direction that you were no longer pleasing to the eye, and you released your finger from the shutter button after you'd got to that point where the film advance had released. Next time you pick the camera up, you check your film advance to see if it's cocked. The film advance lever would move, you'd wind past and you'd have had a blank exposure. And the alternative is equally frustrating. It's where you press very gently on the shutter release, the shutter fires, but you haven't reached the point where the film advance releases, in which case Next time you pick it up, the shutter, the film advance won't go until you press the film release button. So getting this right is tricky, so I'm just give this half a turn, which is a big rough increment, but it'll serve our purposes. Get my top cover back on again, and I'll just hold the top cover firmly in place and just test it. That's the film advance releasing again, so I've got to go a bit further. Let's give it another half a turn. I thought I was on the cusp of releasing the film advance then. I can't detect a second click. So the shutter's releasing at the correct point now. That's good. Well, let's remove the top once more. I'm not coming in here again. Make sure there's no dust on the inside of the finder. Put our top cover back in place. Fit its fixing screws. And the story is almost over. Okay, well, that's it for this camera, I think. A nice, clean, tidy example of the Retina IIc camera. It had been given to me because the previous owner had taken it apart in an attempt to repair it, but hadn't had the time to complete their mission, and who knows what state it is when the camera arrived with them. So what did we find with this? What were its faults? Well, we know that the shutter was very, very gummed up with oil, to the extent I suspect somebody had given it a little squirt of something oily. It's possible that it was originally, it had just sweated out of the focus helical. That sort of thing does happen, but the amount of oil that was in there, I don't think so. I think that had been added by someone. The cocking rack was ruined. When I say that, and here it is here, the teeth at this point are completely wiped over. I really don't think I can get those back up. To rescue something like this, you'd really have to cut those teeth out. There's two teeth there that are problematic. You'd probably have to cut them out and solder a new piece in, or a piece from another rack. So we had the rack. the transfer shaft was broken. Now that's very unusual because I've never seen anything like that before. We were missing one screw, like that. What else was there? Oh, it was a spring. One spring was somewhat mutilated. I think that's about the sum total of it in terms of what was replaced. I was able to clean up the shoe somewhat, fix the screws somewhat. The case really doesn't need anything done to it. The leatherette at the base of the camera, well, we've got an obvious crease in the leatherette there, that's never going to go away. I suppose you might go mad with a hairdryer trying to warm that and iron it out, but yeah, I really wouldn't recommend it. But the main thing is, it came here as a pile of bits, and now it's ready to go off to a new home. Thanks for watching. When you go to put the lens back on the camera, it's most important that the red dot lines up with the red dot in the shutter. And then it just quick part turn clockwise, it just latches into position. If you get it wrong, if you manage to wedge it in some other position, it'll jam. There's nothing surer than it'll jam. And that's a real problem because it'll sit in there cockeyed and it'll be useless. And the other thing is when you try to get the thing out, because it'll be exceptionally hard to get it loose again. I can just tell you that now. And what tends to happen is when you force it to try and get the thing back out of the bayonet, the whole mount twists, shifts in the shutter, and that pin from the mechanism plate that came up and positioned the plate, that'll get bent over and it'll snap away from the mechanism plate. And that's death to the mechanism plate. So you want to avoid that. Always be careful to line up the red dot when you're inserting that lens.